Pump and Void Rays, and the warp gates need to be warping in Zealots or Stalkers, preferably closer to the enemy base, through a proxy pylon. Proxy pylon. It's like we do see some more Zealots from Dragon, though. And some more Void Rays, finally. Now we see this fleet beacon, and he hasn't really... He's made no carriers at all, so right now it's not really justified in points cost. It's like we see some kind of Zealot attack. Now they're going to get countered by these roaches. These roaches weren't vastly outnumbered, they just eat these Zealots up. And if we'd seen any scouting on Dragon's part after the initial worker scout, then he would have been able to produce Immortals which would just eat these roaches. See, now these Zealots just stopped here, which is never a good idea. You always want to keep constantly pushing. Some resistance from Hydralisk and a Roach. And all the Zealots are down. Now Dragon only has these 4 Stalkers, a few Void Rays, and that's the extent of his army. He does have this Twilight Council though, but as soon as it was built, it should be researching either Charge or Blink, depending on whether he plans to go mainly Stalker or Zealot on his army. This fleet beacon is still just sitting there. Useless because there's no carriers. And these Stargates are sitting there useless. Looks like he's upgrading his air units from the Cybernetics core. But once again, these warp gates are just sitting there, not producing anything, and they're wasting minerals. If Dragon were to have, even if he just snuck all the way around the base and dropped a proxy pylon right here, he'd be able to keep an immense amount of pressure on Nath. And at this point, I don't think Nath would be able to handle it. He has a relatively small standing army. And that's one of the things I see in a lot of Bronze and Silver games, is, especially Bronze when they're straight out of Practice League, is that neither side likes to keep a large army up. Having a large army is really important, especially early game, and that way you can transition strongly into a mid game. And also, you want to constantly be producing forces from your warp gates or your Stargates to keep pressure on the enemy, and that way they don't build up a huge army. And you can't really keep that pressure up unless you're constantly producing people. You do need to know when to stop, though, because it's possible to overexert your forces and just lose them all to harassing and pushing the enemy, at which point you'll just be decimated by his forces. But it's always better to keep pressure on than just to sit there and get overwhelmed by 80 billion Zerglings. It's like we see a few Mutalisks, some more Zerglings. Space is finally starting to get saturated, but these workers are just sitting there. A couple Corruptors out of Nath, probably to counter those Void Rays. Now, even if you can't make more Void Rays, which he can, it would be a smart idea to make a small cluster of Phoenix, because they're really good, especially at harassing workers on expansions, especially against Zerg. You just fly 5 or 6 of them in, and then pick up the workers one at a time, and the Phoenix will just eat them. The Void Rays going for the kill on this expansion. Taking down the Queen so there's no resistance. Here comes the backup. Warrior's gonna retreat out of the way, which is a good move. You don't want to leave your forces just there to die. Now these warp gates are still just sitting here. At this point, with the 4 gate, Dragon should have many more forces than he has now. Even if he was waiting just for these Dark Templar, he should be constantly producing Zealots, because the chances are, at this point in the game, the Zerg's gonna have some sort of observer in his base. Even though he really doesn't, but he ought to. So he needs something to distract the enemy forces so his Dark Templar just don't get eaten. Again, we need to see these constantly producing something. At this point, both Dragon has 600 points, or 600 minerals, and Nath has over 5,000. Both players need to be doing something with those minerals, because they're not going to help you sitting there in your bank account. Looks like Dragon's finally got a few Dark Templar up. Looks like he's going to go some more Void Rays. Now, a key part of making an expansion is, especially your first expansion, you need to transition units over, and you also need to key both buildings to make workers for that expansion, and that way you can get it saturated way faster. It's like he's finally researching Blink at the Twilight Council that sat there for most of the game. But now he has both of these Nexi, and he needs to be chrono boosting something. So again, this fleet beacon is just sitting there. He bought it, presumably to make carriers or mothership, and has done neither. It's a waste of precious resources. Now the Void Rays are under attack, and these Stalkers are just sitting there. This is a great time to use those Warp Gates for backups. And this is when you should keep the pressure on, because most of the time players don't attack with only part of their army, they attack with all of it. So it's very likely that he has very little defenses left in his base. And especially against Zerg players, they're really good at creating a new army after their old ones die, after their old one's defeated. So you need to constantly keep pressure on them. The best time to beat a Zerg player is after they have failed attack. It's like they're gonna be distracted by this roach. And an observer is going to have only ground units in these Void Rays, so these Void Rays are going to have to focus on this observer, or these Dark Templar are going to get eaten. There's the observer, and now the Dark Templar are invisible. Now it's a good idea, especially with Void Rays, to even include a few Zealots, just because the enemy, it makes them divide their attack. Now it's unusual for a Zerg player to good game at this point, because he's got two full bases. If he had a queen at this base, and he does have a queen at this base, he could be constantly producing forces to fight off this attack. This is by no means a defeat. It would also be a good idea for Dragon to destroy these creep terminals, especially these two, to keep it from spreading any farther. Because the ones with the blue sacks on them, those are the ones that can continue to spread creep. These have already expanded. And with the creep highway like this, he can get to your base significantly faster than if there was none. It would be a good idea for Dragon, at this point or especially earlier, to have gotten up a robotics bay with his thousands of minerals left, and just plop one down, even just for warp prism, so he can come down here and reinforce his forces directly. His warp gates still need to be doing something, they're just sitting there. And so are these stargates. You don't want these probes just sitting here, especially after the gas is gone. You can move them down to your expansion or make another expansion. Looks like Nath has amassed some sort of last resistance. Presumably the good game was a distraction. There's gonna have nothing to see these Dark Templars, so even if he gets these Void Rays down, he's gone. Dragon's gonna move his forces up into the enemy base, hopeful to find no resistance at all. Here's the Queen and the Observer, if these Void Rays are paying attention. There we go. And now the enemy base is defenseless, because he cannot see these Dark Templar. He has no sort of protection at all. And that's basically the game. Dragon really should have... He could have won this game significantly sooner if he would have kept pumping units. There were many times when he was wasting resources, like on this fleet beacon, and these stalkers, and he was just letting these guys sit here. I don't really think the 4 gates were justified. Usually if you're going to go that, you can go 2 or 3, especially if you're planning to get early Void Rays. Because he really didn't need all 4 of them at any point in the game. Especially when he just left most of them just sitting there most of the game, and relied on his Void Rays or the few troops he had standing to defend his base. Also, I don't really see there being justified as warp gates and not just gateways, because there was no way to get them into the enemy base. A good warp prism or a proxy pylon is usually seen by as Protoss players' way of keeping up the pressure on a Zerg player, because it allows it evens the playing field, because they produce their units directly there, and you can produce your units closer by, so you can reinforce faster. But other than that, another thing is that they bronze players and lower league players usually don't keep aggression up like they ought to. If we would have seen some more aggression out of either player at the beginning of the game, it could have changed the game completely, and this wouldn't have ended up being a 10-minute game and not a half-hour game. Both players just kind of sat there with the few troops they had at the beginning. Well, this is my second commentary and also my second broadcast. This is Wondersmith, and thank you for listening. Later.